What I want to do is, given that we are running a little bit behind time, we've been speaking mostly so far about services in larger cities and developments in larger cities. I might go straight to Stephen Lucas and Peter Ferris and ask what resonates and doesn't resonate with you as operators in regional Australia of the sorts of discussion we've been hearing so far. I mean, is the situation in regional Australia different, or are we seeing the same kind of pressures and likely to see the evolution of the same kind of opportunities going forward? Pete, do you want to?
Thanks, John. Look, it's very different, and I think there's three things fundamentally different. We have low population densities, we have very low levels of congestion, and we have very high access to private cars. People aren't as time poor in regional cities as they are in regional centres, sorry, as they are in the cities. So it's a much different scenario. That's not to say we can't do things better than we are, and I think we've been largely, in New South Wales, largely constrained by a network design that came out of the 1990 contracts of coverage, where we had to cover the town. 80% of the population had to have a bus route 400 metres or less from their house. So we cover the town, we don't necessarily design the best routes.
Steve?
Yeah, Peter's right, and it is different. However, the solutions are the same. The reality is that technology is going to be the driver for mobility solutions for regional areas as well as for urban cities. And the discussion we're having today should be very important for regional people to get their head around the sort of thing that Laurent was saying, that you've got to turn yourself into a mobility provider, not just a bus operator.
In terms of the way you look at public transport, I mean, at the risk of gross oversimplification, we tend to differentiate between mass transport, which is really about the heavy trunk routes, and local or social transit, where we're talking about the regional context and we're talking about outer urban fringe development areas. I guess one of the risks that I see is, as we move to the kind of mass type initiatives, that the commerciality will squeeze the transport disadvantaged social market, so that'll, in fact, the people in that will get worse offerings than they're even getting now. What are the opportunities? Well, do you see that as a problem in the first case, and how might we respond to that sort of situation in regional Australia? How do we deal with that risk, if you like? Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, well, it's about doing a better job with these particular sets of customers than we currently do. And in order to do that, we need the assistance of government. The difficulty that we're all going to have in the future is that the bureaucracies that we deal with are incapable of properly doing their job currently. So how the hell are they going to operate under this new paradigm? It's going to be very difficult for them, and we as an industry have got to be pushing their political masters so that they can actually come up with frameworks within which we can operate to provide the sorts of services that we believe we should operate. And the trick there is going to be try a whole lot of different things, because there's no one solution. All, especially in regional and country areas, the demographics are so different and the solutions are going to be so different in each area. So we're actually going to have solutions that are place-based, not overarching framework-based.
Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, Stephen is right, and
that's unusual.
Flexibility is probably the answer. As Stephen said, there won't be one answer, but flexibility is probably the answer. In New South Wales next year, we can expect on-demand trials in rural and regional. The Minister said he wants to see those. That will give us the opportunity to trial new systems, new processes, and yes, there will be different answers in different situations. But getting back to your point about the people we carry today are people who have no option.
Yeah.
The elderly, the poor who don't have access to a car. How we can serve them better in this environment is the challenge, as well as attracting some people who do have an option.
Yes. I'm going to depart from script here a bit. Michael, in Canada, with your paratransit and your mass transits or your local transport systems, how are they confronting the challenges in the low density settings? I mean, How's Canada moving in this space?
Well, they're not. They're not yet. I mean, to be perfectly honest, we're not at the cutting edge of any of this, and part of the reasons I think is that public transport in Canada is operated by municipal departments that are typically part of the local government structure and are very, very slow to respond. And as I mentioned, they don't have a mandate to do much more than what's asked for by the local government, which is to run, similar to your situation, a bus network that has stops no more than 400 meters from 90% of the population. And as long as you have that sort of a coverage model, obviously in bigger cities it's more ridership driven and you have more of a trunk and feeder type system. But there's not much incentive really for them to be at the cutting edge, which is why there's this big question about where and when are we going to break out of our existing paradigms, and who's going to do it. The transit managers are not hired to do that. It's not part of their mandate. It's not part of their skill sets. It's not, you know, unless you have a few that are really enlightened and visionary and want to push the envelope, and there are a couple. The difference is really in the bigger metropolitan areas where you have regional metropolitan agencies that are more at arm's length from local government, have their own boards. They're able, like Metrolinx in Toronto, like TransLink in Vancouver, like the new agency that's just been set up in Montreal, they're going to be the ones to really experiment with new ways of providing better service, in particular in the lower density suburban areas where the challenges are greatest and where the service quality is the poorest, and to link that into the rail and BRT services.
Yeah, can we sort of segue that a bit into the what's happening, as I said, in Toronto at the moment, where I think they're introducing minimum densities on the fringe of 80 persons plus jobs per hectare as a greenfield density requirement. Now that's something like 25 dwellings to the hectare, which is probably 50% higher than we're seeing in greenfield development in Australian cities in the more compact settlement patterns at the moment. Is that actually starting to happen, and do you think that pressure for much higher densities on the fringe in our greenfield growth areas might be a significant part of the solution to this problem?
Well, I think it will happen. It's not happening yet because there's a big time lag between policy and what happens on the ground. There's usually about a 10-year development pipeline that's already been approved. So when you have a change in policy, and what happened in this case was the provincial government changed the Municipal Act, changed the Land Use Planning Act, introduced a green belt around the city, set up Metrolinx. So there were a whole series of interconnected policy changes 10 years ago that were designed to intensify, to make the growth of the city more sustainable and to link it into the public transport investments. Now, there's a lot of tension between the province and the local governments. The local governments don't like this. They don't like to be told what to do. They don't like to be told to have certain densities. Plus, we have a very unusual situation in Ontario where there's an appeal board where any local ratepayer group or developer can appeal a development approval to this municipal board. So a lot of things happen that, or don't happen, that depart from the plan. All that to say, however, that these densities are great, and you know, I applaud the direction, but I don't think they're enough, because ultimately a uniform density even at that level isn't going to be sufficient. I think what we really need to focus on is not so much the density levels, but the concentration of the densities around nodes and along corridors. So there's this concept of mobility hubs. There are about 25 of them across the metropolitan area, where the transport investments are being focused and where they're trying to encourage high mixed-use development, so that it's not just the residential density, and people often forget this. Often the employment concentrations are more important than the residential densities. And I think that's the key, and that's where Vancouver has done well in developing these nodes around the area that are connected by high-frequency rapid transit.
Oh, Lorraine, you wanted to...
Well, just to give you a perspective, I think if we split between very dense, mid-dense, and low-dense areas, on high-dense areas, I think, of course, solution is also to be considered as, you know, heavy modes deployment and integration, multimodality is very key. And I think we do have the solution. We can demonstrate today that we are able to reduce congestion and make the life of the people easier. As far as mid-dense area are concerned, I think it has been mentioned, we see a number, in fact, the majority of Uber rides starting or ending on these areas. So it's our job to bring, and why? Because there is not a good public transit connection enough, I mean, to be able to give the right service to the people. And here, we really consider that ride pooling would be, together with maybe with some last and first mile autonomous shuttle services, could be the answer and should be the answer. And it's our responsibility to provide this as a solution, a component of the public mobility system. Now, as far as low-dense areas are concerned, I would say on regional, I would say that I don't think we have the solution yet, as far as we are. We do provide coverage, but and on the other side, we don't expect the autonomous vehicle to bring us solutions soon on these areas. So for me, it's still an open issue to understand exactly how we can provide. Flexibility will be key, but on the other side, I don't see, you know, on such territories how a dynamically, you know, real-time demand responsive system could work to a really at a acceptable cost.
Do you have a sense of what the minimum urban area size is that you'd be thinking of for autonomous vehicle application?
Well, for autonomous vehicle, the issue is more the technology. I mean, it's, of course, we can adapt to that city. The issue is that on one side, when we operate autonomous vehicle shuttles in an urban environment, not you know the very high density traffic, but somewhat you know low mid dense traffic environment, we think we'll be able to deploy this type of solution quite soon, because in fact the shuttle has a lot of information to manage itself. And by the way, these are still, I would say, a few kilometers, you know, as sections. If we consider putting an autonomous shuttle vehicle, you know, on a road for you know a number of kilometers, etc., we are still far away on my view, and that's a technology issue.
Clint, this is not scripted at all. In regional UK and regional England, for example, where you've got a deregulated system, and public transport bus has been losing, you know, patronage hand over fist. Do you see the sorts of developments we're seeing, talking about here in Mars and integrated mobility, driving that down even faster?
Well, certainly the regional UK landscape is changing very quickly. So they've just passed a bill in Parliament in the UK to move back to a more regulated environment. So municipalities can take control of their public transport once more, because I think, and the driver of that is this type of stuff, because at the moment, yeah, there tends to be monopolies in those cities, and the large companies like Stagecoach and Go Ahead and First Group and others put their assets where they're best used, but that means that the social transport misses out, because you're not going to put the bus down the street that only one person lives on. So I think they see, you know, reintroducing kind of the social element. So I think there is a push downward, because the technology platforms allow us to better, again, put those assets where they're best used, but the social aspect misses out. So I think the re-regulation of the regional UK market will see a balance between, you know, the commercial companies chasing greatest passenger counts versus, you know, delivering the social aspect.
The bridge technology that you talked about previously, I mean, do you see that as suitable today in places like, say, Wangaratta or Albury-Wodonga or maybe Launceston?
Well, the short answer is yes. We started on the 1st of July a contract in Albany in Western Australia. So we have 17 route service buses in this small town, and very low patronage, and it's an ideal environment, I think, where we could put a far fewer number of buses out in that city that's operating completely on a demand-responsive platform to collect the ones and twos in a much more efficient, dynamic manner.
So as a kind of short-term response to problems of transport disadvantage and risks, if you like, of MARS in our lower density areas, that kind of technology might be a really practical way forward to deliver more effective and more efficient outcomes.
I think so, but the other aspect of the social element is that we need to understand how to deal with the people who don't have access to the technology. If we're going to run the public transport on a technology platform, how do we let people in? The United States have a really good program that's federally funded, where if you're disadvantaged and on welfare, you can access a free mobile phone, a smartphone that's sponsored by a telco company, and it's locked so that you can do your banking and you can do your transport planning on your smartphone, but that's it.
Yeah. Peter, the trials that are happening in New South Wales at the moment, do you see any of those as really strongly likely to assist us, be very encouraging in terms of better outcomes in terms of the social transit area?
It's hard to tell, John, at this stage. I think one of them's just commenced and the others are yet to commence, but it certainly the answer is flexibility, and as Clint suggested down in Albany, there's a better way to transport these people, socially disadvantaged or not. And getting back to an important point Michael made about employment, we do not get people to work in country towns unless you work in the CBD, the shopping centre or the hospital, because employment's spread so widely across the region. Certainly flexibility, and I don't know the answer, but flexibility, whether these people will handle the technology, the socially disadvantaged, whether they'll, and the aged, particularly the aged, how quickly they'll pick up that technology. It has to be a simple process, whereas young people pick it up straight away. So I think that's also a challenge.
Yeah. I'd like to ask each of our panel members, if you're thinking globally, the places you know, who do you think are the shining lights or the leading cities or regions in terms of the application of public transport in a progressive way that's conscious of the wide range of outcomes that need to be pursued and sensitive to tailoring services to meet those, at the same time encouraging innovation? I mean, who are the 2 or 3 places you would tell us to look at? Clint, do you want to lead on? Don't say yourself, okay? Other than your company.
Well, I think if I was to pick a geography, it would be a hard choice, but I would have to probably put Singapore at the top of the list because of the great public transport links that are already there, the population density. You know, the model is perfect from an effective use. Car ownership is cost prohibitive for most people, and the government is very progressive, and they have tons of money that they're pouring into this stuff. So I think you'll see a lot of the thought leading come out of that city going forward.
Steve?
Yeah, I agree. Singapore for me. I think mainly because they've got discipline, they've got the money, and they've got a body like the LTA, which is always looking to find new things to do.
Full of a lot of Sydney University PhD students.
Yes.
Michael?
It's always difficult to, put us on the spot and ask us to come up with a particular city. But personally, I think Singapore is a bit of an unusual kind of unique situation with a city-state that has a lot more control and direction. I'd put Vienna on the table, partly because it's one of the leaders with MAS right now. We heard about Helsinki yesterday, and certainly Finland is at the cutting edge. But I think the difference is that Vienna is trying to tackle this from a public sector perspective, and they've set up a MAS platform that's developed by the local government and the regional kind of metropolitan fair consortium, and they have an incredibly effective public transport system already that's really world leading, I think, in terms of its effectiveness and its mode split. yet they're at the cutting edge in terms of moving to this next level from a public sector vantage point. And I think they are number 2 on the world's most livable cities as
Behind
well.
Melbourne?
Yes.
Laurent?
Yeah, I think we may have a different case. For large cities, I think part of the answer is whether they are willing to both push forward the public transit but also restrict the use of the private car. And I think that's why maybe Singapore appears on the top of the list due to the, the local situation. But also, I will say in continental Europe, in Northern Europe, there are some cities, Helsinki being one, Vienna, maybe also Stockholm are also interesting cities. Also, maybe Oslo, sorry, maybe the first city in the world to prohibit the car, the private car. And that's, yes, some people say by 2020, 2025, there may not be any private car, in Oslo. Now, if we make the case for, and these cities are starting from a point where there is a very efficient and effective public transit system. Now, if we come back to the local community issue, then I would argue that in the US, there are some very interesting moves. Also, to build on what Clint was speaking about, we see, for example, VIA implementing local community services in California, in Texas, where there are very limited public transit, regular bus lines. And basically, they move out of these bus lines to implement, like on-demand transit systems with smaller vehicles. And that's also very promising for this type of, I will say, area and communities. So we speak about, let's say 20, 50,000 people on mid-dense area,
Peter?
Dubbo. We do have to find a solution in Dubbo, just as we have to find a solution in Singapore. So, it's a huge challenge. An interesting number, nothing to do with this conversation today. In Australia, our population density, I think, is 455 people per square kilometre. In Hong Kong, it's 57,500. So there's some different markets out there, and that's the challenge, certainly, for us in regional Australia.
Yeah, quality people, though. Quality people. Yeah. If anybody in the audience like to put a question to our panel members while you're thinking about that, or we're supposed to be talking about integration in this session, so I better spend a few minutes doing just that. Clint, where do you see the 2 or 3 main areas that we as public transport players need to be focusing on better integration? Is it within ourselves? Is it with government in terms of public transport? Is it with government in terms of land use? Where should the priority be?
Well, I think the integration that's essentially required to have an efficient city is in network planning. And if you've got a number of participants within the market that need to participate in that network planning, then either government needs to be the facilitator of that and lead the network planning initiative, which they do in most cities. But where the network planning becomes dynamic and we're using MAS or a technology platform where you're measuring demand and dynamically designing the network on the fly, then I think the integration needs to be with the technology platform itself, and arguably the government should control that technology platform, or there should be a consistent technology platform across the city.
Stephen, do you think our governments are that good? I was
You know the answer to that, John.
Before you answer, I was struck in your presentation, Clint, by an industrial estate. Scott, would you say 19,000 jobs and no public transport? How are those public transport planners going to solve a complicated problem? I mean, really, what are they thinking? Steve?
Well, the big issue for me in this debate that hasn't been discussed is show me the money. No one's talking about the cost of this. You've got governments heroically saying, we'll put out a tender for people to innovate, which means we don't know what we're doing, tell us please. What they don't understand, it's all going to cost them money. And people like Clint and Laurent their companies are investing in this stuff. but it's not making them any money yet. They're making that investment on the hope that in the future this conglomeration of technologies and services and stuff is going to turn into something worthwhile. Now, I suspect it will in some cases, and in other cases it won't. But the thing that industry's got to be careful of is going down a rabbit hole that's just a big black hole with nothing at the end of it.
Chapter 9 in my book.
Just probably a follow-on from Stephen's. I mean, everyone holds Uber up as this fantastic model of mobility choices that's actually, but it hasn't been successful everywhere. I mean, so Uber's licence in London has just been cancelled to operate, and their appeal was rejected yesterday, so they're out. So I'm interested in the reason. I think something similar might have happened in one of the provinces in Canada. But Clint, why are they cancelling their licence? Is it because there's too many new cars and they're just creating congestion, or is it because they're not actually a transport operator, they're just a bunch of drivers just interested in Uber?
I'm going to be really interested to see where Uber goes, because they came into the market in a very aggressive fashion, not working with government but working against government. And now I see them at these lunches with the minister schmoozing and saying, we want to work with you, government. We want to deliver public transport. So, I mean, I think there are some serious flaws with the Uber model, and clearly it's heavily subsidised, but I still use it. You know, it's convenient, and I use it over a taxi. So there's clearly a demand there. But I think what they're trying to do is deliver a service similar to public transport. They're subsidising it. I think the key with our technology is not to make money out of it, but to deliver the same services for a lower subsidy. It's going to cost money. I mean, most of these things fail. You know, Bridge in the United States was running in competition to public transport, and that's a very hard thing to do because the revenue is not there. Public transport is subsidised. This service in the United States wasn't subsidised. We're bringing Bridge to Australia to be integrated into the public transport network as a subsidised service, as a key link. It's the idea with this technology is not to be another Uber and run in competition, but it needs to become part of the fabric of the city and our existing network.
Maureen, would you like to add to that at all in terms of your autonomous vehicles, for example? How do you see that interfacing with Uber?
Well, more generally, I would agree. I fully agree. The point is, you know, we should be on top of this type of technology, and that's what we are trying to do. But in order first, of course, to optimize them, to integrate them into a full mobility service, which has to be subsidized apart from a few very dense zones. You can operate a full B2C service in some, you know, very high density zone like CBDs, where you will find high wages people willing to use them, you know, and spend some time doing their mail or whatever, even in the congestion traffic. But apart from this, and that's what we are studying today, and that's what we are demonstrating in some areas, is the fact that we should not think about it as a service competing with the public transit, but as a service which will be part of the mobility services as a public transit. But then it does mean that we have to invest. I fully agree. We have to invest, we have to invent the model, to also question part of what we are doing. In some cases, it may replace a regular bus line. In some cases, it will create, you know, more traffic, and then we may come back to a regular bus line. And so we need really to be proactive, invest, and demonstrate this to the municipalities, to the public authorities, and then it's back to them, you know, to enable us to develop this kind of service, to deploy it, and to manage it together. A last word would be when we speak about, you know, how do we integrate it, about how do we manage the data. That will be absolutely key. And I think we need to find the right way between two obstacles. The first one being, not sharing the data at all. If we don't share the data, if we don't share the elements, we won't be able to develop a proper service. And on the other side, data means value. So it should not be, you know, the open data for everyone, meaning the GAFA will make money with them. So that's also something we are very strong, especially in Europe now, with the European Union, in France, in a number of countries where we say, okay, we need to open the data on a more reasonable manner so that we can get the value out for the community.
Thank you. Just one last question to the whole panel. What is the one most important thing you would say to government that they need to be doing in terms of facilitating the developments that we're talking about, but making sure that they don't leave too much chaos in their wake? Now, Peter, do you want to...
John, it's regulation and funding, and...
That's two.
I know, but I didn't answer the last question. Uber came in a very uneven playing field, and don't start me because we're taxi operators, and on the 26th of November, when we hand 12 plates back in Picton and Camden, it's going to leave a lot of gaps because Uber are there Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, but they're not there Monday morning and Tuesday morning when the old lady wants to go to a doctor's appointment. So regulation, we've got to be careful with regulation that we're not too constrained as our current contracts are on the flexibility of providing services. But we have to ensure that we protect everyone and give operators the opportunity to innovate and introduce new ideas.
Thanks, Pete. Olorette?
Yeah, 2 words, anticipation and speed.
Doesn't sound like you're talking about government. Michael?
Well, judging by the show of hands in the room earlier on, there seem to be a lot of people out here who are prepared to give up their car if there's an attractive shared mobility option available. And I think that the role that government has to play here is to send signals that it is prepared to move towards incentivizing and supporting more of a shared economy as opposed to a privately owned economy where everybody has 1 or 2 or 3 cars.
Yeah, Michael, can I say in 1968, I'm showing my age, I did my honours thesis at Melbourne University in congestion pricing. Now, I had a boss once who said every good idea takes 50 years to be implemented. 50 years is 2018. So if we can get congestion pricing in next year, all your problems will go away.
You're dreaming. The answer for government is to enable and get out of the way.
Clint?
I think they need to move away from political decisions. So some of these decisions are hard. Restricting the use of cars is difficult, and it's not a wise political move, but these are some of the hard decisions that need to be made to enable this space.
Yeah, thanks, John. Special thanks to each of the presenters today. Fantastic presentations, fellas, so congratulations. And of course to the other panellists, your wisdom is always appreciated. Just a simple one, taking up on the point that Peter made about the old lady trying to get to her doctor's appointment on the Tuesday morning. We've heard a lot of very positive stuff about MAS and how it's operating in various parts of the world, and about connectivity, and Clint raised the very high proportion of people who have smartphones in Australia. I'm just interested in the international experience where these things are probably a bit more commonplace than they are in Australia, how it's the old lady and the gap, the traditional customers that we have, not just in Australia, I'm sure it's all throughout the world, of the people who don't actually have access to the technology that seems to be a fundamental connection between MAS going forward and that group of transport disadvantaged, elderly, disadvantaged type people. Is there any experience on how those people don't fall through the crack if we move from one to the other?
Who would like to answer?
I think it's a big problem, Wayne. I think it's something that we're grappling with. I mean, we have a demand responsive service already running in Western Sydney, where the old ladies phone up the depot and book onto the bus, and the bus does a couple of runs each day and picks up the people who want to go to the shopping centre, and then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon it goes back to the shopping centre and drops them all back home again. We want to use that as a bit of a test bed to see what the uptake of technology would be like. So if we, it's very low patronage, so we could probably buy them a smartphone each. But I think if I can teach my old girl how to use Uber, and now she's addicted to it, I mean, anybody can learn. But I think it's a real problem. I spoke about the federal government funding mobile phones in the United States. I mean, I think if we're moving quickly in this direction, I think the federal government here needs to think about the 10% of people who don't have access to this technology in the country, because I think it's a relatively small cost for government to make a very big change to those people's lives.
Yeah, maybe the first thing for me is a question of the price point before the access, the technological access. So it does mean that we, as you mentioned, it has to be subsidized, apart from the very high density zone, because of course, I will say, low wages may not use Uber 2 times a day, of course, given the price. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, in terms of technological access, we may come back to very simple, solution like call centers. You may work together with the app on one side, but also the call center on the other, so that people are, supported in order to get access to the service. So it may also be a solution, to have 100-person, or maybe close to 100-person, I guess anybody can use a phone. So even apart from people having, disabilities, but so that's where I think we need to reintegrate the technology, use the platform and the app and the digital solution together with the means enabling people to get access to them. So I don't think we will push everybody to use the smartphone, maybe at least for the short term. In 5-10 years, it may be different, as it will be more and more, business as usual for everybody.
Okay, well, I think we're now right on time, so it's an appropriate time to thank Thorab Australia again for sponsoring this panel, to thank our 5 panellists for the contributions that they've made, and to thank you all for getting here after last night's great evening at the courtesy of Mercedes-Benz. Morning tea this morning is going to be sponsored by Bus Finance Australia. I guess just a couple of closing comments, the takeouts that I've had from this session. I think fundamental to a lot of this stuff is us understanding and controlling the externalities. I mean, cities and regions are absolutely full of external costs, things like congestion, air pollution and so on, urban sprawl. It brings a lot of these things together. If we don't get on top of those, then a lot of the stuff we're talking about now has got the potential to get completely out of hand, I think. And if we do get on top of those externalities, then we can push solutions much more in the direction of shared use, which is fundamental in terms of dealing with problems of disadvantage, social exclusion that can be exacerbated by the sorts of things we're talking about. And I think a lot of this is going to turn in the end on how we free up the flows of money that Stephen talked about that are going through the system. At the moment, there's a lot of money going into community transport, some of which is well used, a good bit of which isn't. And if we don't take this opportunity to integrate better in regional areas, our community transport, our route services, our school services, our taxis, and pooling funding flows, probably with the funding actually being channelled through the provider but to the customer, so that the customer has a means of identification that says they're entitled to fares of a particular category, whatever mode they travel on, and the operator, who he or she may be, gets reimbursed for carrying that customer rather than for just running a vehicle up and down a road. I think that's pretty revolutionary stuff, but I think that's probably where we're going to need to head on this. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your participation in this session.